Okay, hey, we're going to a very special episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a little bit of a collection here of just really cool retro divers watches, and all kind of laid out representing different kind of crossover eras from the 50s and 60s to the 60s and 70s, kind of all there for you. And there's quite a mix, and you'll see there's some things that they all have in common, and there's some things that they each have that's very different as opposed to the rest. So they're all quite unique, but I think kind of all within the similar genre where you might actually cross shop some of these watches against each other, although they do vary in price point and kind of country of origin in terms of also in terms of their brand prestige and brand ownership, and their basically their original business model, whether it be from when they first opened or if they've been kind of rejuvenated, repurchased, and revived. So with that said, you see we have Zodiac, Doxa, Seiko, and Squale, and they're all here essentially kind of in this black and steel configuration on tropic style rubber straps, to just kind of get in touch with, I think, a very nice trend that's happening, is where we're just kind of getting back to the beginnings of dive watches. And I think that's something that some people might be a little sick of vintage watches, but I think there's something about the mystique of vintage divers that is really, really special. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they were so technology rich. They were just these kind of experimental new things that really became very accessible to normal folks. And although not a lot of people necessarily needed the certain level of water robustness that they offered, they still had it, right? And it's nice to have and not need versus the other way around. So with all that said, I'm just going to kind of go over, get these compared a little bit here, and we'll have a chat. So let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get these pieces in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, guys, let's actually start with the most expensive watch here, which is the Doxa, which is actually on a Joseph Bonnie Tropic style vulcanized rubber strap. Very nice. I think it suits the watch really well. Of course, I think it suits kind of this vintage aesthetic, even though probably out of all these watches, the Doxa is probably the most, I'd say, out there in terms of its unique and daring aesthetic. Now, a little bit about Doxa. They were established back in 1889, and then they were eventually acquired by the Yenny family back in 1997, kind of beginning its most recent modern era of watchmaking. This is their sub 300, and this goes for about $2,500 direct from Doxa. The case size is 42.5 by 13.4, and it's 45 millimeters lug to lug. And I will say, in this watch, it wears a much smaller, and a lot of it has to do with how small the dial is and that kind of dial to bezel ratio to case ratio. And you can see there's a lot of overhang, right? So the dial is all the way down here, and then you get a wide bezel that's actually broken up into two sections. And also, one thing to mention, guys, if you're looking for the full review of each one of these pieces, they all do exist in my channel history, so definitely take a look there. I'll try to make a link either at the end of the video or down in the description if you do want to get into specific details on each watch. Now, this watch is really great. But it costs a lot of money, right? It's not cheap at around $2,500. It's by far the most expensive watch here, but hey, it's still Swiss made. It has an SW200. It's a chronometer, so COSC, which is great. You're getting that 4 hertz sweep, only a 38-hour power reserve, but you do have that great time telling, right? It has 30 atmospheres of water resistance, which is pretty good compared to the rest of the pack here. It's only really outdone by one of the other watches, which is very, very feature rich, kind of by across the board. 20 millimeter lugs, which all of these do have, which is great. And it's a lovely watch, and it has some cool unique features like this great really thin mid case, which really helps break things down. It's kind of hollowed out underneath, and really the only parts that are going to touch your wrist. It's such a small contact patch, and then visually when you look at it, it just appears much smaller. I mean, if you compare it to something like the Zodiac, which, I mean, this is a small watch. It's a 38 millimeter, right? It doesn't actually look that different in terms of sizing. Yes, you can tell one is larger than the other, But you know, for a 38, or let's say this beautiful Seiko here, this nice SPB 317, the Slim Turtle. If we look at these, they look very similar. And this is a 41 millimeter diameter. They even have a very similar kind of side profile with that mid case. Of course, here though, you're going to see high polished versus fully brushed there on the Seiko, but they do have that in common, which I think is really cool. And it's one of the things that help thin out both of these watches, because that mid case visually is going to kind of represent the thickness of the watch. And of course, your eye is going to be drawn to seeing that these are, you know, separated. You do have the mid case, you have the case back, and then you have the bezel. And then even in the case of the Doxa, you even have that beautiful box dome sapphire crystal, which adds even more height, but you kind of don't count it because of all of the other surfaces that are kind of breaking down that visual weight for you. So very, very cool. But let's go ahead and actually, in terms of the initial intro, let me get all these. Of course, it's going to bother me to have all the buckles laid out. Let's get to the Squale. So some of you are going to be upset. I'm pronouncing it Squale. That's fine. That is the pronunciation. So they were established back in 1959, originally founded by Charles Van Buren, now owned by the Magi family, which were the former Italian distributors. This is their 1521 Classic COSC certified model. So it's the 50 Atmos. And this one is actually really, really special. It's a boutique only model that you can't really buy, you know, unless you're buying direct from them or you're going into one of their authorized dealers. This goes for $1350. It's a chronometer. It has applied indices, which is different from all of the other models that you're going to see. I shouldn't say all of them, but for most of them. Also, you're going to have this really cool bezel insert, which is fully loomed, which is also a nice touch. And then, of course, you know, full on Squale strap and everything, Von Buren signature there. Very nice. Wears really well. 500 meters of water resistance. This has also a 41 millimeter diameter, and then it's only 12.7 millimeters thick, which, considering the fact that this has 500 meters of water resistance, that is really, really impressive. And then also you do see that it does have very short lugs that do curve down quite a bit. The lug to lug on here is only 48.4, and then you're getting, of course, this sapphire with inner AR coating, 120 click bezel, which I will say, out of the rest of these, this is quite loose by comparison. Not loose to the point of feeling sloppy. It just, I don't know. It could definitely feel a little bit tighter in terms of the action. I would prefer a little bit more resistance, but it does have, very nice. I mean, the action is very nice. It's very audible. But yeah, you know, this basically, in terms of spec, apart from the Seiko having an extended power reserve, which of course is a trade-off because it does have the lower hertz movement, you know, this pretty much has every other watch here. In terms of spec wise, this has more water resistance. It has the applied indices, you know, it's the loomed bezel insert, all that, COSC certified chronometer, still Swiss made like the majority of the watches here. So this one is really huge value proposition. And of course, you know, this case is very famous. Something that Squale used to do. They would produce these types of cases for multiple brands, some of them being very high prestige brands like Blancpain, even down to, you know, the Tag Heuers of the world. Well, actually, they were probably still just Heuer back then, but you kind of catch my drift there. This was a very popular case, and it was, at the time, you know, a real advancement in terms of being able to have all of that water resistance in a relatively thin case. Although I will say you get some beautiful depth. Look at that high polish rehaut there, you know, playing off of the inside of the crystal. It's just, it's a very beautiful watch, and it's one I should probably wear more. It is very, very nice. But It's not the only watch here. So one thing also to mention, also 20 millimeter lugs. All of these are 20 millimeter lugs. Also Sellita SW200, so it's going to have same specs there as well. Now moving on to the Zodiac, which actually, before I do that, let's get a side-by-side 41 next to a 41, just to show that, yeah, there's a big difference when it comes to, which I think both of these were smaller than your typical 41, but you can see there, and also, interesting enough, the Slim Turtle is only, probably 0.2 millimeters thinner than this watch, which is funny because no one really thinks of this watch as being slender, although it is, considering especially that it has 500 meters of water resistance. So I think that's definitely very interesting. I think they look quite handsome next to each other. Yeah, so with that, let's move on to the last Swiss member here and kind of go really way back, but also, because considering 1882 in terms of the original founded date, but it's now owned by the Fossil Group. So it's kind of, it has some in-house qualities in terms of it being within the group, and you having, essentially an assembly that is all, and all the components come from the same ownership. So you do get some of those positives there. This is going to be cheaper than the other three Swiss watches at $11.95 direct from Zodiac. This is their Super Seawolf 53 skin. So this really goes really way back there, right? 1953, kind of the original times when dive watches were first being produced. And Zodiac was one of the first brands to actually make relatively accessible dive watches. And honestly, dive watches were pretty expensive for the era because of the technology that was in there. And that's not just the related to the brand, like, and anybody putting on a dive watch, it was one of their more expensive models that they were selling. Here you're getting a 38 millimeter diameter, so very true to form in terms of that old school, very vintage aesthetic. It's only 12.8 millimeters thick and 46.5 millimeters lug to lug. So really short lug to lug on this one. And again, it's like 0.1 millimeters thicker than that Squale. And it only has, by comparison though, 200 meters of water resistance. This and the Seiko have matching water resistance. You're getting 120 click bezel. Very notchy, very audible. And you actually do get a loomed bezel insert here as well, and you're getting ceramic. So I guess that's one other feature that the Squale does get outdone with. You get a ceramic insert versus here, it's just kind of coated metal insert. So very nice from that perspective. Very simple, I would say. This is definitely going to be out of the three here, well, I should say the four, the group of four. This is probably going to be the most universally handsome in terms of it just having, there's not a lot to really offend anybody on here, which means that there's a lot to like. Also, you're getting a no date setup versus here all the other ones do have a date. Complication here, you're getting no date, so you're getting it to be very symmetrical and very handsome. And the inside here, it's while the other two Swiss watches have Sellitas, this one actually has an STP movement, which is the STP 111. But it pretty much matches the same specs, having that 38-hour power reserve and beating at 4 hertz or 28,800 vibrations per hour in terms of its beat rate. This one just doesn't have the same level of accuracy guaranteed. It's not to say that it can't be as accurate, it's just not COSC certified, meaning that this movement and this watch didn't go over to COSC to have them measure the time and do the printout, right? So again, it doesn't mean that it's not capable. It doesn't mean that it's not finished to a certain aspect in terms of the movement. I would say the movement that's in here, SCPs, typically will have a higher level of finish right out of the box. They don't really do too much. They pretty much have perlage just like at some of their cheapest options versus the Sellita. It's funny, it's kind of like it grades out, where ETA you can get some really stock, very clean, not decorated ones, but then for When you get into Solitas, then you're pretty much starting at a closer to an elaborate A grade, and then because they're doing a little extra, right? Because they're not the original. Same thing for the STP movement; they're doing even more extra in terms of trying to add that value and getting some more decoration in there. Solid case back, nicely etched, again 20 atmospheres, and on a very nice proprietary strap from Zodiac with beautiful finishing. Check out the finishing on the buckle there. Very, very nice multi-surface, multi-finish. You're getting the nice hairline brushing with a high polished chamfer, and then everything is fully milled. So this is actually a very nice strap, which I did review. But that actually reminds me, I don't think I did the bezel action on the Doxa. So let's go ahead and get that out of the way. Very tactile, reminiscent of the Zodiac from that perspective of it being very, very clicky. Not quite as smooth as some of the other options, but with that, it does feel more precise and more dialed in because you get the trade-off in terms of the smoothness. Also, this is loomed, this orange pip here, although it's kind of hard to tell. And honestly, for recreational diving, you're probably not going to be in pitch black waters because most recreational divers or even just going snorkeling, you're probably not going to go deeper than 40 meters. So it's nice to have the extra water resistance and everything and having the loom, but in reality, you probably don't want to have to depend on it. It's better to just kind of there be enough light and be waters that aren't so murky that you can't see your dial just under the natural sunlight. So very nice from there. And then last but not least, we do have this Seiko. A little bit about that brand. Of course, founded in 1881. It is the oldest brand here, so kind of fun. And of course, just because they're old, it doesn't mean they started making dive watches as soon as they were open, right? This was like a 1968 model, which was right around the time the Doxa was being made, around 67, when they were working with Jacques Cousteau to kind of co-create the watch. This is the Prospex SPB 317 J1 Slim Turtle, and it's essentially a reimagining of the 6105 8000 series, which is that cooler, kind of more symmetrical model that predated the Willard, which was famously worn in the movie Apocalypse Now. But this has a 41 millimeter diameter. It's only 12.5 millimeters thick. It's 46.9 millimeters lug to lug, so still relatively short there. You're getting, of course, stainless steel brushed and polished with this nice Dia Shield super hard coating, and you're getting a sapphire as well, single dome, nice inner AR coating. You're getting 120 click bezel. I do like the mixture here, where it is quite clicky, but not being notchy, and still relatively smooth. So in terms of my personal preferences, I do like the way this one flows. It doesn't feel loose, it doesn't feel overly tight. So somewhere in the middle there, which is something that I really enjoy. And of course, this is a Japanese watch versus the Swiss watches that are behind. Also, you do get this nice protected loom pip there, which is shielded by a piece of probably, I would say, Hardlex crystal, but it doesn't say, but you never know, it could be sapphire, but either way, it's nice that it's actually shielded versus some of the unshielded options here where that loom can tarnish or patina over time. Inside, you're going to have the Seiko 6R35 movement, 70 hours power reserve, which is going to go ahead and be ahead of the field here, but it also is going to have the lowest beat rate. So instead of beating at 8 ticks per second, it's only going to be beating at 6 ticks per second, or you can call that 3 hertz or 21,600 vibrations per hour in terms of the beat rate. This also has 20 atmospheres of water resistance, but this is also an ISO compliant diver, so it does meet those requirements. And then the bezel itself looks like it's probably just an aluminum insert that's been coated, so nothing too special from that perspective, but it does have, of course, the fully graduated increments there, so you can time, every minute, every second, which is nice. The case back is stamped and etched. Of course, it has that very famous and popular wave pattern there from Seiko. Very nicely done. This one is actually on an original Tropic rubber strap. Not original to the watch, but original to the brand. Tropic rubber straps, which are, I believe, now owned by Synchron Group. So they did bring those back. These are also vulcanized rubber, and honestly, out of all of the straps that I've ever had that were Tropic straps, this is by far my favorite. It also happens to be the one. Although I will say the buckle is very nice. Some people have pointed out that the inner parts of the buckle aren't finished as nice as the outer parts, where you're going to get the nice, chamfer there and the brushing. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of a drawback. Honestly, I didn't really notice it, or I don't really care about it. But some of you who are really, want to justify the price point for you, if it's just a little bit out of reach, and that's something that you will use to kind of nitpick to make you not buy the strap, then that's what you're going to do. If not, then you'll probably just enjoy the watch on the wrist like I have. So these are all really fun pieces. And with that said, let's actually, I guess, get them on wrist for a bit and just kind of talk about their wear profiles. Okay, guys, as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, this Squale looks really, really nice. Nicely centered, and of course it is black on black with all of that reflective, fully polished case, kind of reflecting off of the room here. So that is also going to kind of either add or detract to the visual weight, kind of depending on the background. But for comparison's sake, I do have the Zodiac, which these are kind of in similar price brackets. Of course, the Zodiac's gonna be a little bit easier to track down and purchase versus this COSC model, which is gonna be a little bit more limited. But, of course, if you're not tracking down the COSC model, then you can save a little bit of money as well. You would just be getting a printed dial and a more basic bezel insert. But I think out of the group here, these are kind of these nice in-between pieces that I think really anybody could really enjoy, even if you're not a huge watch aficionado or diver, or you could care less about the brands. You just want something that embodies a simple dive watch, and you want something Swiss made, of course. I think these are two very good options, and one being on the smaller side for those of you probably smaller wrists, and one being on a little bit of the larger side. But when you see how well it wears, I wouldn't let that detract you. If you were very interested in owning or wearing one of these pieces, check that out. Of course, just with a tighter aspect there, you're going to see it better centered on the wrist with a little bit less lens distortion there. As compared to here, you can see even on my kind of larger 7.5-inch wrist, some of you are probably thinking this might be a little bit too small for me. I think it definitely fits the aesthetic in terms of it being very vintage, very retro. So I don't mind that at all. I think it kind of, again, suits that look. And then, of course, if you have a smaller wrist, then this could really be kind of the champion for you. So with that said, let's actually swap out now onto the other two watches. All right, guys, as you can see, the Slim Turtle, one of my most worn watches of last year, really fantastic. Wears well on the wrist. Of course, if I do get it too close to the lens there, it's going to look a little oversized. So I'll go ahead and tighten things up here so you can get a look. And this is a really great watch, especially for the price, guys. 900 MSRP, and you can definitely get it for a lot less than that. And I do enjoy this strap, although it is a bit long. So for those of you who have smaller wrists, you might find it overly long. But with that, of course, there is this watch and this strap. This is a Joseph Bonnie Tropic strap, which is a much shorter by comparison. So if you do have a smaller wrist, you probably are going to want something more like this. And it also is really well constructed and well executed, and you can see it on this watch. So I think these comparatively, they do wear smaller than probably their dimensions will, make you think. With the I'd say the Doxa being even larger, physically, I think it does actually visually appear a bit smaller. And a lot of it has to do, again, with that layout in terms of the bezel to dial ratio. It has a much smaller dial. And then again, yes, Swiss made chronometer. That's going to bode well for a lot of you that are collectors. And if you are really big into the brand or just into collecting, Doxa is a really strong name with a very strong following. Of course, Seiko is very strong as well, but Seiko, they make a lot of watches, which means there's a lot of fans, and there's a lot of people with a platform to complain when there are QC issues, and people don't really mind complaining about a watch they didn't spend too much money on. A lot of times, if you have a QC issue with a very expensive watch, some people just will go get it taken care of. They're not liable to go, flame the brand just because it can be kind of embarrassing, right? You spend $2,500 on something, spend $5,000, $10,000 on something, and then you notice a speck of dust underneath something or something that doesn't line correctly. Typically, when you're doing something like that, you're just going to want to get it resolved and not necessarily do as much venting. But this piece was actually lent in by Doxa's their marketing department, so appreciate that from them. Definitely did want to get it on a comparison here, especially since these watches are from a similar era with a similar kind of different take on the cushion case there, with the nice refined kind of edges on the sides of the case, making that mid case very, very thin. So for those of you that are really looking for something that, no one's ever gonna see a Doxa on your wrist at a watch meet and say, oh my gosh, why'd you buy that? They're gonna want to take a closer look, and they're gonna be like, oh man, I've always been intrigued by those. Like, it's a very hip watch, it's a very fun one, and there's plenty of enthusiasts out there that know a lot about Doxa, and then there's also people who know nothing about the brand really, but they know that these are collectible and very sought after watches. So I'll give Doxa their flowers there. So it is going to be a lot more expensive compared to the Seiko. And then, a Seiko can be a bit of a mixed bag in terms of, the fandom. Some of the worst critics of Seiko are some of their biggest, customers. So I've been very fortunate that I have, a lot of watches and have experienced even more through the channel and have had really good experiences with my Seikos in terms of QC. It's not to say that they're perfect, but no brand that I've ever gotten anything from has been absolutely perfect. Apart from, maybe a handful of watches to include like my Grand Seiko. Yeah, there wasn't really any QC things there that I could easily call out, even under a loop. But Seiko, great solid brand. And again, this is a watch that you could wear that is very functional as well. And if you bang it up, it's the cheapest one, so it's be the cheapest one to replace as well. So that is also helpful. But with all that said, let's actually get these off the wrist, set up for some loom shots, light transition, and closing thoughts. All right, the moment you've all been waiting for. Let's go ahead and hit the lights here. And as you can see, some very unique loom here, especially from that Zodiac, which I will say that I did get confirmation from the brand that they will be swapping out that orange loom to something more traditional with future iterations. So you might get a watch that looks exactly like this, but actually has different loom. As to when that will start, I really can't say, but let's go ahead and give it just I'll use the black light here to give it a little extra charge. Same goes for the Doxa. The Seiko and the Squale don't really need the extra charge. They're kind of very easily burning very, very bright. But you can see here that they definitely do the job. You're getting a lot more surface area in terms of the coverage for the Squale, especially with that bezel insert. Although I'd say, those indices are a little bit smaller, but the nice thing is that they are applied if you get the COSC version, so you're going to get a bit of a thicker coating than you typically would from the standard version with the printed dial. So this is going to be much stronger in a lot of ways. This is kind of top tier Squale 50 Atmos loom. And then, you know, maybe not the strongest loom example for some of the other ones. I know they do a full loom dial, Doxa as well. And, you know, Seiko, par for the course, they're typically going to have pretty good loom. This isn't some crazy one that is like top shelf in terms of it's like not tuna or monster level of, you know, application, but still very, very clean and nice. But one thing, of course, I always like to work in to these low light, to these loom shots is a bit of low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying, wow, that actually looks really cool. Direct sunlight. Sometimes you're going to be, you know, coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, maybe just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it's nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. And you guys can see here, it's not all just relying on the loom. A lot of times it's relying on the way that light is going to be captured on these dials, which these are all really, really fun dials in terms of their level of symmetry. I mean, these all do scream kind of dive watch, vintage dive watch, classic diver. And I really do enjoy that about each one of these watches. And really the only one that I don't own is the Doxa. I would eventually like to add one to the collection, but they are quite expensive. So, you know, if you are like me, you know, you want to find the right one, and there are a lot of variations of Doxa, but I think they're definitely worthy to be in a collection, especially if you do love a good dive watch. You know, of course, they do have those iconic orange dials. I'm kind of torn. I really like their blue dial option, and then even some of their more modern takes, like the fully loomed white dial, I think looks really, really cool and kind of brings a little bit of play to, you know, kind of a serious dive watch, a serious tool watch. But, you know, guys, I went into this. I'm sure I rambled quite a bit. Thanks for hanging in there with me. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of show these all next to each other, because you don't always get a chance to look at these watches next to each other. And I do think there are probably plenty of people who see one of these watches on their Instagram, you know, feed, and then they like it on a Tropic strap or on a NATO, and then they kind of want to get, you know, achieve a similar look. Just for those of you that might be cross-shopping between any of these models, yeah, you can pretty much get a similar look from any one of these watches, although I think they do have a great level of individuality. So I think that's something where they all really excel in. They do have their own little quirks, whether it be, you know, having a crown at 4 o'clock, or, you know, an offset date, or, you know, an odd use of color, or, you know, just skeletonized framing on the second hand. There's just a lot of fun things. And then the brands themselves are very different. I'd say Doxa and Squale are similar in terms of they're owned by, you know, some of their previous distributors now, but still, you know, more of a revival micro brand. And then Zodiac probably being somewhere in between Seiko and Doxa and Squale in terms of the fact that they are a revival, but now they're owned by a larger group, you know, the Fossil Group. So they do get some of that in-house vertical integration that you would get with Seiko, right? So now you're getting these movements that come from the same, you know, from the same operations standpoint that the cases will, and that the assembly, and it's more integrated vertically. So you're going to get some really cool things, and Zodiac is a really nice historical brand in terms of their vintage stuff. I'd say for all of these, right, you can get vintage variations of all of these, and in some cases for less than the modern version, but you're going to want a waterproof dive watch, right? So you don't necessarily want to get a vintage dive watch if you don't have a great watchmaker nearby to test everything and put in new seals. So it's nice to be able to have fun with these watches and use them the way they were intended to be used. And, you know, and also take advantage of some of those modern updates, whether it be the loom, whether it be the level of robustness, fit and finish, and all the advances that have come with modern production. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do a like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.